So what I'm going to do at this time is show you how to make the additional parts that you'll need for your automata, as well as showing you how you will assemble those things together. By the time you're done, you'll have your automata parts in there, have it assembled so that the follower tracks the motion of the cam. So far we have our box parts and we have our mechanism parts. There are a few more files that we need to, or parts that we need to actually go in and model. So let me show you what those look like. The additional drawing files that you need are in the mechanism parts drawing files folder. So up until now we'd had just these first four. Now we're adding this additional part called follower with point edge and eccentric cam. So let's start with the follower with point edge. The drawing file for this shows that this is basically very similar to the axle. It is a 0.25 by 0.25 square prism. The important difference here is that this has a radius applied to one end. And the reason that that's important is that we're going to need that radius for the follower to smoothly be able to ride along on the cam. So let's talk about the cam and what it looks like. There are lots of different kinds of cams. For this prototype, we're going to just use this one type of cam called an eccentric cam. And basically that just means that it has an off-center hole. So it's just a circle. This one is of diameter 1.5 inches. And it has a 0.27 by 0.27 square hole. There's a little tolerance there so it can slide onto the square axle pretty easily. And you can see that it's just 0.25 inches in depth. So the first thing you'll need to do is model those two parts. You'll need to model the follower with point edge, and you'll need to model the eccentric cam. Once you have those things modeled, then we need to go through and actually start assembling things. So I showed you an example of what the finished assembly looks like. What I want to do now is take a minute to just build that up for you so you can see what that looks like. So what I'm going to do is pause the video and get this to a good starting point. So what I have at this point is just the automata prototypes enclosure, just the box in other words. What I need to do is insert those additional parts and then start putting in the correct mate types that go along with those. So I'm going to click Insert. Now in mine, I chose to model the mechanism parts in a separate file or in a separate part studio. So I'm going to click and just insert all three of those things. I've got my axle, I've got my follower guide, and I've got one bushing. I'm going to need two bushings, which are those little sections of straw that we use in real life. So I'm going to go back to Insert, and go back to my mechanism parts, and I'm going to insert a second bushing, and I'm going to click OK. I did go through and change the appearance for these things to make the follower guide and the bushings a little easier to see. You don't have to do that, but I think it's kind of a nice touch. So the first thing I need to do is I need to actually assemble the bushing into that circular hole. And for that, I'm just going to use a fasten mate. I'm going to find the mate connector for that hole. I'm going to orbit around and find the mate connector for that bushing. And you can choose whether you want the bushing to be sticking into the enclosure, so this sticks so this is nice and flush at the end, or you could choose to have it offset some. I'm just going to go ahead and click OK. And so now my bushing is set in there. I'm going to do the same thing over here. So I'm going to go and find the center mate connector of this. I'm going to find the center mate connector of this. And let that get assembled there. So that all looks good. So that's great to start with. The next thing I need to do, the next thing I'm going to do, you could do this in a few different orders, is I'd like this axle to go through the bushing and be able to rotate or spin freely. So we know in Onshape we can use a revolute mate for this. So same kind of thing, I'm going to choose the mate connector at the end of this axle, and I'm going to choose the mate connector for that bushing, and I'll click the check. It's a little hard to grab that and rotate it, but you can kind of see if I grab and rotate the axle that spins inside there. One thing that's a little bit of a pain with Onshape is that if I were to edit that revolute joint, I can't really slide this thing over using my offsets because the only choices I get for that type of mate connector is rotate. I don't have the ability to move it over and translate it sideways. So what I might choose to do for this is instead of mating it to this one, I'd kind of like the crank handle to be on this side. Let me get rid of that or undo that revolute. And I think what I'm going to do instead is I think I'm going to choose the other side bushing so that it ends up right here. Whoops, let's flip that around so it goes the other way. So now I've got this long axle that's sticking through there, and that all looks good. Next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and actually insert the cam that I've modeled elsewhere and the follower with point guide. And before I do that, I do need to put in my my follower guide. So same kind of thing. I'll grab the mate connector here. I'm going to choose this mate connector here. And because this is a fasten mate, I can choose to offset this some. And it looks like I need to offset that in the Z direction by about like -1 inch or so. So it's kind of sticking halfway through there. That looks good. So now I need to go through and insert those additional parts that I've made. Now I modeled those things in a different part studio, but I can still go through and insert those. If you chose to model those in a different document or a different part studio, you can still definitely go through and get those. So one thing I need is the handle. So here's my handle. Then I need to go and find those additional things that I made. One is the eccentric cam that I modeled elsewhere, and the other is the follower with point guide that I modeled elsewhere. So here's my follower that I made. So I've got those parts. That's great. I'm just going to go ahead and start with inserting and assembling this follower with point guide. What we need to do is think about what kind of motion I need for the follower in the follower guide. And so what I need is for that thing to be able to slide up and down, which kind of tells me which type of joint that I need, or which type of mate that I need. In Onshape, I just need a slider mate. So very similar to how we did our fasten mates, I'm going to find the middle of this. I'm going to come around and find the square end of my follower guide, or my follower rather, and I'm going to insert that in there. Now, that put my point edge at the top. I don't want that, so I'm going to flip direction so that the rounded edge shows up there. Now, one really important thing, I need to make sure that that point edge is going in this orientation. So in other words, if you looked at it from the right, you would see the radius of that thing. That's going to be important because of how it interacts with the cam in just a second here. So let me slide this back up out of the way some. You notice that all I can do is slide this up and down. I can't move it side to side. And so the last piece that I'm going to do for right now is assemble my cam onto the axle. So for that, I want the cam to turn whenever the axle is turned, so I need a fasten mate for that. I'm going to go ahead and grab myself a fasten mate connector, or a fasten mate rather. I'm going to choose the mate connector on the end here. Actually, I'm not. This part is a little tricky because the cam has a square hole. Oftentimes it will not show you, it won't show you the mate connector that's sort of in the empty square area that's missing. So what I'm going to do is actually choose the mate connector that's on the side here and on the side, but on the end of the axle here. And then I'm just going to use an offset. I'll look at that from my front view. I can see right here that I need to offset it in the X direction. So let's go ahead and offset that. Let's see if 3 inches is correct. Maybe I need to go a little further. Let's try more like 6 inches. What I want to do is basically get that so that it is right underneath my follower. That looks great. I can click the green check. Now, when I rotate this axle, you're going to see that the cam moves along with it, but it's not yet interacting with that follower. To get the follower to actually ride along with it, we have to add one more type of mate, and that is called a tangent mate. So we want the edge of this follower guide to ride along on the cam, and so specifically what we're going to choose is this little edge right here. So we're going to say that we want the round face of this cam and this edge to be tangent to one another. So I'm going to click on the green check. And just for simplicity's sake, to make it easier to do the animation, I'm going to go ahead and add the handle, just because it gives a nicer place to grab onto stuff. So again, I'm going to choose the mate connector that's on the inside face there. I'll choose the mate connector that's on the end there, and I can offset this by a little bit in the other direction to move that handle in some. Maybe I want to insert that just a little bit. That seems fine. That's a little wonky. Let me go back and edit that fasten mate for a second. What did I do there? I need to flip that. Look at that. There it is. Okay. All right, so now I can grab that handle, and that's a little easier. All right, let's get this back to a place where we can actually see this. So I'm going to go ahead and grab my handle, and what you're noticing now is because I have those mates in there, I've got a fasten mate between here and here, so when I turn the handle, it turns the axle. I've got a fasten mate between the axle and the cam, so when I turn the axle, it turns the cam, and now I have this tangent mate between the cam and the follower, which means that this edge should always remain tangent. In other words, should always follow the path of that circular cam. And because that cam is eccentric, meaning the hole is off center, the follower is going to rise and fall as I move that around. And actually, if I look at this from the front, what's really nice is when the cam is at the lowest point, this follower is still sticking up out of the guide. So that looks really good right there. Okay? So by the time you're done modeling and assembling those parts, this is what this should look like. Now, if you're choosing to do this in Fusion, it's going to look very similar. It's going to work very similar. Mine looks a little different because I went ahead and I applied some materials to this. So I made these different colors, for example, by applying different materials. You're going to see the same kind of behavior, though. I've got my eccentric cam in there. When I turn the handle, we see the follower rising up and down. Okay? So in Fusion, these are rigid joints instead of fasten joints. It's still a revolute joint and still a slider. The only thing that's really different there is just the sort of the appearance there, and this tangent joint here is the same kind of thing as in Onshape.